Doesn't everything feel like it's slowly starting to unravel? When life and the rules that govern it start to fade like chalk on a rainy sidewalk, washed away slowly, imperceptibly, under your feet as you go about your day, is that day now? This isn't a history lecture. It's a walk through the present, through a city, through a metaphor, and through what it feels like when the rules that shape our world start to fade. Tirana has this way of making even heavy thoughts feel walkable. Cafés still hum, people still laugh under umbrellas, the streetlights glow like they're refusing to panic, and I keep thinking about an old question that won't leave me alone. What did it feel like to live in Rome when the rules started applying less and less? Not the dramatic fall of Rome moment that history books love. Not the day some gate breaks and everyone screams. I mean the slow part, the personal part. The part where you wake up and realize something subtle has changed, the law still exists, the institutions still exist, but they don't feel binding in the same way. Trust starts leaking out of daily life like air from a cracked vessel, and people quietly try to adjust. I'm Scott Layton. I'm walking the streets of Tirana, Albania, an American expat. And no, I'm not saying that Western civilization is Rome. I'm not saying any country is fated to collapse. I'm saying something broader is unraveling. The norms that taught us how to live, how to treat each other, how to disagree, how to trust, how to cooperate, how to believe that the system is real, that truth matters, that restraint exists, that rules apply to the powerful too. In our lifetimes, that order felt stable enough that most people could ignore it. Now it feels thin. Everything has started to change. And Rome is a useful mirror because Rome didn't collapse all at once. Rome transformed, and from the inside, transformation doesn't feel like destiny. It feels like adaptation. The Roman Republic was built civic virtue and a deep cultural fear of kings. They had this civic immune system, an idea that power must be limited, that ambition should be restrained, that public virtue mattered, at least in appearance. The Senate met, offices rotated, checks existed, and even when it was corrupt, it still pretended to be accountable. Then incentives shifted. Rome expanded. Wealth poured in. Inequality widened. Politics became a blood sport. Private fortunes swallowed public life. Generals became celebrities. The crowd became a weapon. Patronage replaced citizenship. Power became personal. And if you lived through that shift, I doubt you said, the republic is collapsing. You probably said, politics is getting uglier. You probably said, the rich are untouchable. You probably said, the mobs are angrier. You probably said, truth doesn't matter anymore. You probably said, everyone is picking a faction. You probably said, it feels like the old rules are still on the books, but they don't really govern. That is what this moment feels like, because what we grew up calling the Western Order or Western civilization was never just a military alliance or a stock market or a constitution or historical stories. It was a set of habits. Rule of law, shared truth norms, restraint, accountability, trust. The assumption that the future bends toward improvement, that institutions, though imperfect, correct themselves. And now the world feels like it's moving backward, not because everyone suddenly became evil, but because the systems increasingly reward selfishness and punish cooperation, and people forgot what it meant to act way before the pandemic started. We are sliding from citizenship into spectatorship, from shared life into transaction. And you can see it everywhere, not as one problem, but as a cascade. Economically, we live inside winner-loser incentives. Companies fight each other to dominate markets, not to serve populations or the commons. Short-term gains crush long-term sustainability. Individuals become little firms, branding themselves, optimizing themselves, competing endlessly for shrinking security. When society feels like a tournament, people stop behaving like neighbors. They start behaving like contestants, and it changes everything. It changes how we treat strangers. It changes how we treat friends. It changes how we look at each other. Look at culture right now. Looks maxing, constant self-optimization, body hacking, cosmetic procedures, filters, performance of desirability, performance of status, the pressure to be seen and ranked and validated, not because people are shallow by nature, but because the incentive structure teaches them that worth is market value. That's not kids these days. That is what happens when a social order quietly stops promising dignity and starts selling it back to you. Rome had its own version of this. Luxury is politics, status is survival, virtue replaced by display, and when the public life is hollow, the private life becomes performative. Bread and circuses weren't just entertainment, they were social management. distraction, emotional control, spectacle replacing civic engagement. And in our time, the circus is algorithmic. The same systems that could have strengthened community instead monetize insecurity. Even intimacy gets converted into a slot machine. Dating apps are built to keep you swiping, not to help you settle, because satisfied people don't scroll. The result is a society full of connection tools and fewer genuine connections. People begin treating humans like profiles, options, consumables, and then we wonder why loneliness rises and relationships decline. Third places disappear, those spaces where you belong without being sold something. Parks, libraries, cafes, community centers, civic clubs, the public square. Rome's public square became factional theater. Ours became digital. And when the public square becomes a machine for outrage, trust collapses. Truth gets replaced by tribal belonging. Willful ignorance becomes identity. Cognitive dissonance becomes armor. You don't ask, is this true? You ask, is this my side? That's not an accident, that's a business model. And then politics absorbs that same logic. Not governance, dominance, not compromise, humiliation, not shared solutions, victory at any cost. This is where Rome becomes painfully familiar. The late Republic didn't die because one man crossed a river, it died because the civic immune system failed long before that. The Gracchi tried to reform inequality, they were met with violence and precedent breaking, and once you break precedent, you normalize it. Marius and Sulla turned politics into armed rivalry, and the lesson everyone learned was simple. Power belongs to whoever can force the outcome. Then Caesar, then Augustus, then the Empire, and the Republic's forms remained. The Senate still existed, the ritual still continued, but the substance was gone, because power had moved into personal control. That is the pattern. The forms remain, the substance shifts, and you can feel that shift right now in how rules apply. When rules apply less and less to the powerful, trust collapses. And when trust collapses, mutual aid becomes irrational. Because mutual aid requires a sacred belief that your decency won't be punished, that your kindness won't be exploited. That playing fair won't make you the sucker. When that belief dies, society becomes a field of private survival strategies. Everyone hedges, everyone hoards, everyone rationalizes. That's the 7 deadly sins on steroids feeling people are describing. Greed, vanity, envy, wrath, sloth in the form of disengagement, gluttony in the form of consumption as anesthesia, pride as identity worship. But those are not just moral or personal failures. They're structural outputs. They are what you get when the system rewards selfishness and punishes solidarity. Now, zoom out to the international level, because this is where the smoke becomes visible. We were raised inside a story called the rules-based order. The idea that after World War II, conquest would be taboo, sovereignty would be respected, international law would restrain power, and the truth is, it always restrained the weak more than the strong. But even that thin restraint matters. Now zoom out, because this isn't just cultural or domestic, it's also geopolitical, and that's where the smoke becomes visible. And right now it's being tested openly. The clearest symbol of that is Greenland. Greenland is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, a NATO ally, an inhabited land, not a blank space, not a commodity. And yet we just watched a sequence that tells you everything about the moment we're in. Trump threatened to impose tariffs on European countries over Greenland, tying trade coercion to territorial ambition, and Europe prepared a massive retaliatory package in response. Then came the U-turn. He backed down from the most escalatory posture at Davos. Tariffs were dropped, Europe suspended retaliation, relief flooded markets, and the whole thing got reframed as access and frameworks and deals. And Denmark and Greenland publicly said sovereignty is a red line, not negotiable. That sequence is not just a Greenland story. It's a story about norm testing. It's a story about power treating sovereignty like bargaining. It's a story about how quickly the unthinkable can become negotiable and normalized. Then it's a story about how quickly it gets walked back, not because the rule is sacred, but because the blowback becomes inconvenient. That is what it feels like when rules start fading. And if you want another real-world example of the same pattern, look at Venezuela. In early January 2026, the United States carried out an extraordinary operation capturing Venezuela's leader Nicolas Maduro and bringing him to New York to face charges, and legal scholars and critics debated whether it violated international law, with the core point being that enforcement mechanisms against great powers are weak. Whatever you believe about Maduro, the precedent matters, because what's allowed in one case becomes a template in others, because it teaches the world that sovereignty can be treated as optional. And that lesson doesn't stay in Caracas. It migrates. It becomes permission. And when great powers model that behavior, smaller powers adjust. They arm, they hedge, they become more cynical. They turn diplomacy into deterrence. The UN was designed to prevent conquest, and yet when enforcement depends on veto holding powers, you get paralysis. In Rome, the law applied until it hit a man with legions. In our world, the law applies until it hits a state with veto-proof power. And that isn't just international. You can see the same norm corrosion domestically. Look at Minnesota. After the Renee Nicole Good shooting by an ICE officer, the White House amplified a narrative early. Trump used radical left language around the incident, and controversy grew not only around rhetoric, but around transparency and oversight. Minnesota officials said state investigators could not access evidence because the FBI would not work jointly, meaning the system that builds legitimacy, independent review, open evidence flow, shared accountability, got strained in real time. And this is how democratic trust dies. Not only through dramatic coups, but through repeated moments where power controls the story, controls the file, controls the process, and the public is told to accept conclusions without the dignity of independent verification. Now add the psychological piece, because this is where the Rome comparison becomes personal. In a decaying republic, people stop thinking like citizens. They start thinking like survivors. They pick patrons, they pick factions, they pick tribes, because the middle ground feels unsafe. They stop investing in the shared world because the shared world doesn't feel shared anymore. And that's the common thread connecting everything we've been discussing. Climate paralysis, inequality, racism, loneliness, culture wars, algorithmic outrage, authoritarian drift, geopolitical coercion. All of the issues we face today are related. And those are just recent American examples. You can find more in nearly every Western nation, not the drastic actions America is currently taking, but the slow decline in shared values of personal and civic virtues, how we act and how we treat each other, as well as how we react to perceived and real threats, corruption, incivility, blaming the other, etc. They're related because they share a root condition, the loss of systems that convert cooperation into mutual gain. When systems are winner-loser by design, cooperation is punished. When cooperation is punished, trust erodes. When trust erodes, mutual aid collapses. When mutual aid collapses, you get fragmentation, radicalization, despair, and the return of strongmen who promise certainty. Rome didn't fall because people stopped being moral. Rome transformed because incentives made virtue irrational, and we are building the same incentive trap. Now, I'm not saying collapse is guaranteed. I'm saying we are at a fork in the road. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is literally announcing the new doomsday clock setting on 27 January, and the clock was already set to 89 seconds to midnight last year, the closest ever. How much closer to midnight will the hands tick forward? I'm not invoking that as prophecy. I'm not an augur reading the rain, searching for omens like they did in ancient Rome. I'm invoking it as a symbol of stacked risks: nuclear, climate, disruptive technology, weakened institutions, and failing cooperation. So what do we do from a personal perspective, walking through a city, watching people still live their lives while the air changes? We do what Rome's best citizens tried to do before the Republic hardened into empire. We rebuild the civic immune system. And yes, that requires policy and institutions. But it also requires a change in how we see ourselves and each other. Because if the public square is poisoned, we have to rebuild third places. If the economy rewards extraction, we have to organize for rules that reward stewardship. If dating and attention systems turn humans into products, we have to treat intimacy as sacred again. Slow down, choose, build. If algorithms reward outrage, we have to practice discipline, media literacy, truth as a civic duty. If politics is becoming performance, we have to stop being audiences. And this is where I come back to my foundational layer, the social contract of the commons. The commons is not an ideology. It's the shared world. The air, the water, the institutions, the truth space, the dignity of other people, the future. And the simple rule is this: does this serve the commons? Because Rome forgot that question. It became obsessed with conquest, prestige, faction, spectacle, domination. And when the shared world becomes secondary to private ambition, the rules fade. So here's the choice, stated plainly. We can keep playing Game A, rivalrous, zero-sum, everyone fighting for scraps while the system concentrates power and calls it freedom. Or we can shift to Game B, anti-rivalrous cooperation, building systems where my gain is not your loss, where mutual aid is rational again, where the future is not sacrificed for quarterly wins. And if we don't choose, the choice will be made for us. Historically, the catalyst is never gentle. War, famine, plague, ecological collapse. Rome didn't choose reform, it chose consolidation, and consolidation eventually chose decline. We don't have to repeat that, but we do have to be honest about the moment. Greenland is not just a headline, it's a norm test. Venezuela is not just a scandal, it's a precedent. Minnesota is not just a tragedy, it's a lens into how trust gets broken. And the sum of these things is the feeling we can all sense now: the old rules still exist, but they apply less. When trust erodes, rules feel like optional suggestions, and when that's normalized, civilization changes. So I'll end with the question I keep hearing in my own head as I walk these streets. When you realize the rules are fading, do you adjust to the darkness? Or do you become the kind of person who keeps the light alive in your daily life, in your relationships, in your politics, in your willingness to speak truth even when it costs you? Because the future isn't decided only by men in marble halls. It's decided by what ordinary people normalize. Rain keeps falling on Tirana. The old world is washing away like a park bench submerged in a lake. People keep walking. And so do I.